Good evening. And tonight, two critical fronts shaping global security converge on this episode. First, we examine a revealing Politico investigation into President Donald Trump's unusually small and unimprovised national security circle, a system defined by speed, informality, and immense concentration of power. What does it mean when global crises are handled by a handful of confidants with direct, unrestricted access to the president? Then we return to Egypt's unwavering position on the Rafah crossing. With misinformation spreading about potential agreements and arrangements with Israel, Cairo has reaffirmed that Rafah cannot and will not become a pathway for Palestinian displacement. And I'm Salma El-Fiki, and this is In Focus. Politico's reporting paints a stark picture of how the U.S. foreign policy is currently being run. A tiny circle, close friends, family figures, longtime loyalists, is now responsible for the United States' most consequential decisions, from the Russia-Ukraine negotiations to Middle East diplomacy to the now discussed Venezuela strike. There is no traditional National Security Council process, no formal interagency oversight, and no structured chain of command. Instead, decisions are made at ad hoc meetings, sometimes initiated by the president at a moment's notice. This has produced remarkable access for a few, but also high uncertainty for allies, blurred lines between diplomacy and business interests, and situations where different U.S. envoys may be conducting overlapping or contradictory negotiations without the full visibility of one another's commitments. As global crises intensify, the question is whether such a model provides agility or whether it introduces risks when Washington's signals, messages, and assurances are not aligned. And joining us from Washington to help us navigate this complexity is Mr. Brant Sadler, the retired U.S. Navy captain and former military diplomat. Welcome, sir, and thank you so much for joining me here today.
Thank you for having me on.
Thank you. Captain Sadler, from a military diplomacy perspective, how unusual is it to see global security crises handled by such a small, informal circle around the president without a structured NSC process?
Well, I think it is unique to President Trump, that is certain. I think you saw in the past U.S. presidents, you've seen similar type of dynamics. Franklin Delano Roosevelt, when it came to industrial policy in the 30s regarding shipbuilding, relied on just one or two folks buried deep in the White House who he knew from his time as the Assistant Secretary for the Navy during the First World War. And under Reagan, there were similar types of dynamics as well, but it was always targeted around very specific issues, mostly in bilateral negotiations in the Reagan era with the Soviet Union. In this case with Trump, I think it's important for the parties on the other side of the table to have high confidence that the people that they're talking with are actually direct representatives or have a direct line to the President of the United States. And I think that is something that many of the commentators here in D.C. forget. It's very comforting if you're on the other side of the negotiation table when a Secretary Rubio or a Witkoff or a Jared Kushner says something, they understand that it carries the weight of the president, who is the ultimate decider. Likewise, if they make an offer, they know it's going to go directly to the president before it gets whitewashed or scrubbed in the many layers of bureaucracy. So I think in the current situation, high-level, high-stakes negotiations, it's the right approach. It's certainly the right approach for the personality of Donald Trump.
Politico describes multiple envoys operating simultaneously with Moscow, Kiev, and European capitals. What kinds of risks emerge when negotiations are not centrally synchronized?
No, that is a risk when you have too many cooks in the kitchen, as they
Yep.
say. And I think early on with the negotiations with Russia and Kyiv over trying to find a ceasefire, I think we saw some of that to apply more pressure overtly through economics and military, or to try to provide a more positive, a carrot inducement. And it never really was resolved except for Putin's constant rejection of the carrot. And so now we're in a situation where I think there is a very unified approach. You've got Secretary Rubio, you got
Uh-huh.
Jared Kushner and Witkoff now all in the same room. General
Okay.
Kellogg, who was also involved, former Army general, is noted to be retiring or moving on from the administration in the new year. So, what's important for me is that someone with very deep military operational understanding is informing what's happening going forward. That's still an open question. The Secretary of the Army and the Chief of Staff of the Army's trip to Kyiv recently, I think, is somewhat comforting in this respect, but it's something I watch.
And some argue that a small team brings speed and confidentiality. In real strategic terms, sir, where does agility end and vulnerability begin for a global power, do you think?
Well, if you want if you want to deal badly, you're going to get a deal badly. And so it really matters on the results. And we're still too far from anything putting pen to paper to really judge on that. So for me, it's the results that matter and what the deal is. Will it work and will it be lasting? Clearly, for the Russians' part, they're still far from making a deal. So we'll see. Again, I come back to what's important is the tactics and the military operational experience that's critical to stopping and freezing the line of control between these two warring factions or forces in Ukraine right now.
The article also highlights an expanding portfolio: Russia, Gaza,
Mm.
Venezuela, all funneled through the same improvised network. How does this affect the U.S. military's ability to plan coherently and across theaters?
Well, right now we're in negotiations, so it's not so much military operations
Okay.
per se. For the negotiations with Ukraine, the military aspect would be making sure that there's good, sound military experience informing where the effective line of control is the day that a ceasefire is signed so that it's defensible and so that neither side can restart the war easily without taking on significant risk and cost. So that's the military experience. The other, and also the delivery of perhaps weapon systems to compel Putin to come to the negotiating table. So that's where the military plays there. In Gaza, I think it's much more now in the diplomatic sphere where that fighting has shifted. It's on Israel's shoulders, so to speak. But again, it's oversight from the U.S. and I think from the intelligence agencies to make sure the Israelis are honoring their side of the deal at the same time. What's happening in the Caribbean and Maduro, that's a much more comprehensive situation. You need the military because of ongoing operations. So senior advice. It's clear the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, General Raising Kane, is definitely close to Trump and is advising on that front. On the diplomatic and political, you've got someone who knows intimately the region and Secretary Rubio
Mhm.
that's also close on this. But this one, what's happening in the Caribbean and again with Venezuela, that's perhaps the one that's most comprehensive, where military, diplomatic, and economic all need to be coming together.
But when what you say about when allies maybe say that they're caught by surprise, what does this signal about the reputational and coordination costs for the U.S. leadership?
Well, again, it's what's in the best interest of the United States. And if an ally has something meaningful to contribute or has a significant stake in the issue directly, I mean, having Germany, I mean, perhaps saying they got caught by surprise is far different than a France being caught by surprise, given proximity to the front lines and the threat from Russia. Uh, and Japan, of course, is very close to the United States. There's
Yeah.
been interesting back and forth over statements of the Senkakus and disputes over Taiwan. This is a nature, just a feature of diplomacy. Sometimes it gets taken or addressed later. And again, it's a function of what's in America's best interest and which players have the most to influence or to offer later on. Certainly not a courtesy.
Um, well, Captain, many members of the small team come from business or political backgrounds rather than traditional national security careers. What are the implications when deal making instincts substitute for institutional strategy, do you think?
Well, I think some of that played out with the much delayed getting to the point to where we are now. I think we should have been anticipating that Moscow would have been hesitant to enter any ceasefire until the winter muddy season would have potentially set in, and many of the offensives that Moscow has been launching had played out, or at least been staunched by Ukraine. So I think we are where we were going to be no matter what. But again, having that deep military understanding is important, as I stated earlier, and something I watch still as the negotiations go forward.
Maybe looking a bit in the future and looking forward, what safeguards or structures would you want to see reintroduced maybe to stabilize the U.S. decision making during crises?
Well, I've argued for some time, for several years, for a smaller, more focused National Security Council. It has to reflect the personality of the president. It has to work for the president. It is, after all, his staff or her staff. In this case, I think it's important for a president like Trump that it be focused in on results. What are the top 5 objectives or ends that President Trump wishes to deliver on? Clearly, ending the war in Ukraine is one of those. So there should be an office with a small team of deep experts to advise and to help execute and deliver that result. So a much more results-focused, action-oriented NSC, and a smaller one than what we have traditionally seen, very large, more management of the interagency kind of offices. And so this would move away from regional kind of structures to task or objective focused structure. That would be what I would advise the president.
Well, Captain Sadler, thank you so much for your insights. A crucial conversation at a crucial moment. Thank you so much. And tonight's second story turns to Cairo, where Egypt has again made its position unmistakably clear. Rafah is not and will never be a corridor for the displacement of Palestinians. Foreign Minister Badr Abdelati stressed that Rafah's function is strictly humanitarian, aid in medical evacuations out, nothing more. Egypt rejects any attempt to shift Gaza's civilian burden onto Sinai, insists on international monitoring of ceasefire violations, and underscores that Israel's closures of crossings, not Egypt's, are the real obstacles to aid flow. As the Gaza agreement moves to its critical second phase, tied directly to withdrawal and reconstruction, Cairo's diplomacy aims to anchor a rules-based framework: international peacekeeping forces, unified Palestinian governance, maintaining demographic integrity, the full opening of all crossings, and preventing any attempt to alter Gaza's political or geographic reality. And joining us from Cairo is a leading expert on regional diplomacy, Ambassador Hisham Youssef, the senior advisor at the European Institute of Peace. Welcome, sir, and thank you so much for joining me here today. Ambassador Youssef, Egypt has described its position on Rafah as clear, firm, and non-negotiable. What core national principles underpin Cairo's stance?
Well, it's very clear. It is underpinned by international law. And international law does not allow forced mass displacement of people outside their land. And Egypt, along with the rest of the world, except maybe the United States, that was somewhat hesitant in addressing this issue, but now, after the Trump plan, has joined the international community in indicating that the Palestinians in Gaza will remain in Gaza and those who leave will be allowed to return. And now Israel is trying to see how to avoid this commitment that became part of the Security Council resolution regarding the ceasefire on Gaza.
Sir, how do you see Egypt, how does it, maybe if you can share with us and tell us, interpret the second phase of the Gaza framework, particularly regarding withdrawal, monitoring, and reconstruction?
Well, in relation to the second phase, of course, the most challenging issue is to agree on the mandate of the stabilization force, because Israel wants this force to be an active force that disarms Hamas. And there is no country in the world that is willing to send troops to disarm Hamas. Israel has tried to disarm Hamas in a war over 2 years and has resulted in around 70,000 people dead and did not succeed in this objective. And no country in the world will send its troops to advance the objectives that Israel was unable to achieve through war. Now, the objective from the perspective of Egypt, a number of Arab and Islamic countries that have met with President Trump and has issued a statement yesterday in relation to mass displacement, also believe that this force should be a force that ensures and monitors the ceasefire agreement and ensures that the security not only for Israel, but mainly for the Palestinian civilians that have been under attack for the last 2 years.
Israeli media claims displacement corridors were swiftly dismissed by Cairo. Why is controlling the narrative surrounding Rafah so strategically important at this moment, do you think?
Because this is the ultimate battle. The ultimate battle is a battle for Israel to, liquidate the Palestinian question. And this, in their view, should be achieved by displacing Palestinians, both from Gaza and the West Bank, and either to Egypt, to Jordan, or as they have indicated at one point in time, to anywhere in the world. Why? Because this, in their view, is a way to deal with the demographic challenge that will face Israel over the years, that the number of Palestinians and the number of Israelis are very close. And they don't want this to continue to be the case. They want the size of the Palestinian population to be much smaller and much more manageable. And this is faced by resistance from the Palestinian people on the ground, whether in Gaza or the West Bank, and is also faced by an Arab and Islamic position that is quite firm. The Palestinians will not leave, and they will be, hopefully, through this force, protected by this force so that they are not subject to attack day in and day out. Otherwise, they will not send their troops. And this is the challenge that will be facing the Trump administration in the next few weeks in order to see how a mandate can be reached that would be acceptable to the countries that may be willing to participate in this force.
Egypt is advocating for international peacekeeping and not enforcement forces. Can you explain why the diplomatic logic behind this distinction, please?
Well, it's very similar to what I mentioned briefly earlier. Israel wants a force that would disarm Hamas. A peacekeeping force is a force that monitors the situation, separates two fighting forces, and try to maintain this peace and also monitors the ceasefire so that if violation takes place, they would be able to report and indicate that this is what happened. These are the facts, so that the international community can take steps in relation to developments on the ground. So enforcement from the Israeli perspective means that they should disarm Hamas. But while the rest of the international community feels that no, this force should separate between the two fighting forces and also protect the Palestinian civilians that have been suffering for the last years, whether it's from killing or from starvation or from all kinds of practices by the Israeli army.
Ambassador Yusuf, several international actors are discussing training Palestinian police forces. What does a security architecture transition in Gaza realistically look like?
Well, a number of countries, including Egypt, felt that all what was needed was to allow the Palestinian Authority to go back to Gaza. Unfortunately, Israel refused that. Why? Because also they don't want Gaza and the West Bank to be governed by one body. They want the separation and the division between the West Bank and Gaza to continue, because if it becomes united, then the prospects of pushing further towards advancing the two-state solution would put pressure on Israel. And in order to avoid this pressure, they're saying, well, the Palestinian Authority will not allow to be in Gaza, and they want to continue to divide the West Bank and Gaza, while the rest of the world wants the PA. Yes, they want to reform in the PA, but they want the reform back in Gaza in order for the international community to be able to deal with an authority rather than a committee that would govern Gaza. And there are all kinds of challenges and logistical and administrative and legal issues that will be problematic. Now, what kind of law would govern Gaza if you have a
Hmm.
committee or a bureaucratic government? What kind of rules and
Yes.
laws will they be governed by? They have to govern by the rules that were set by the Palestinian Authority in order to unite these two entities, Gaza and the West Bank. But Israel is refusing that, and we will see. This is also another battle in relation to the fight over trying to end this conflict, while Israel is not willing to cooperate on this matter.
Yes. Cairo insists Israel must open all crossings for aid. What do you think are the mechanisms that could ensure compliance and measurable humanitarian access, in your opinion?
Well, there's only one mechanism: pressure on Israel to abide by what was agreed. Sadly, there isn't enough pressure, neither from the United States nor from the European Union. And sadly, also, Israel also always ignores international law, ignores Security Council resolutions, ignores what it agreed on previously. And you can see now what's happening, for example, in relation to humanitarian assistance that is not allowed into Gaza, despite the fact that this is part of the agreement that Israel agreed to. So it's not that they are pushing for something that Israel did not agree to. No, they are pushing for the implementation of something that Israel agreed to. But Israel is making it extremely difficult every step of the way. And
Yes.
this is why the international community has to, get its act together and put pressure to bear on Israel in order for this to take place.
And as the misinformation spreads, how do you think can the regional and global diplomacy better safeguard the Palestinian demographic presence and prevent forced displacement?
Well, if there is a force that is present in Gaza, and if there is control over the crossing, whether it's Rafah or otherwise, with the Europeans who have been in Rafah for a number of years in relation to an agreement that was reached between the Europeans, the Palestinians, and the Israelis, with the Americans helping and with the Egyptians helping. But this is the recipe, and the recipe is clear: to have rules that would be imposed and that Israel should abide by. Yes, of course, we understand that Israel keeps using as an excuse issues pertaining to security, and this should be taken into account. But the problem is that Israel always exaggerates its security needs in all kinds of ways in order to hinder the implementation of the steps that are required to achieve stability in the West Bank and in Gaza as well.
Ambassador, the minister stressed that Egypt will not administer Gaza nor accept any foreign administration. In your assessment, what governance model is most viable for Gaza's transition without undermining Palestinian sovereignty or regional stability?
Well, I'm not sure that this quote is accurate because the Egypt accepted the Trump plan, and the Trump plan has a peace council that is headed by Trump himself. So there is a role for the international community and a contribution by the international community. Of course, both Gaza and the West Bank should be Palestinian led, but then they will be supported by a mechanism that will oversee how things are evolving, what kind of developments are needed. And of course, you mentioned at the outset of our discussion issues of reconstruction. So if Israel is making all these problems in allowing humanitarian assistance in, do you think that it will be flexible in relation to allowing all kinds of material that is necessary and equipment that is necessary for reconstruction? So this will be another battle that will be coming, but it will be coming after the battle that we are
A bit
having
later.
now in relation to the International Stabilization Force.
With ceasefire violations happening and occurring daily, what kind of verification and reporting mechanisms do you think an international stabilization force needs to be effective? And how can Egypt ensure these mechanisms are not politicized or obstructed?
Well, this is not the first monitoring mechanism of a ceasefire in the world. There has been all kinds of mechanisms, and as a matter of fact, the United States brought a team of several hundred people in Israel in order to monitor by itself what is happening in Gaza. And they indicated to Israel that they will use their own drones and get their own information. And initially, I thought that this would be a good step, and on the basis of the information that the US will get by itself in Gaza from its own drones, that it will be much more firm on Israel in relation to all kinds of practices that are undertaken by Israel in Gaza. But sadly, what we have seen is that the United States decided to reduce the number of people in this unit that it has by several hundred people in the last few weeks. We will see. But this will continue to be a requirement in the context of the International Stabilization Force. So International Stabilization Force will also have to have a mechanism to monitor who's doing what so that it protects itself, and it also understands who is violating the ceasefire agreement and in what way, in order for them to report what is happening on the ground and for the international community to respond with appropriate measures, hopefully, in order to address these violations that we are seeing day in and day
daily. Yeah. Ambassador Youssef, Israel continues to push narratives suggesting that Rafah's reopening must be tied to security guarantees. How do you see this information battle shaping international perceptions, and what is Egypt doing to counter attempts to shift blame or responsibility onto Cairo?
Well, as I mentioned, Israel uses always the excuse of security and tries to see what is happening and so on. However, we have, over the years, the Rafah crossing has allowed people in and out in coordination between Egypt, the Palestinian Authority, Israel, as well as the Europeans. This was at the time when Hamas was not controlling Gaza. Now that Hamas will no longer be controlling Gaza, we hope that this mechanism would work, but in a manner that would allow people to go into Gaza and get out of Gaza in a fashion that would allow them freedom of movement, but not forced displacement as Israel intends to do.
And looking ahead, if Israel continues to resist timelines for the withdrawal outlined in the Sharm el-Sheikh framework, what do you think, or could we have as a leverage or a diplomatic, legal, or a multilateral tool does Egypt have and its partners to keep the process on track and prevent indefinite Israeli control over Gaza?
Well, we have President Trump, who will be the head of the Peace Council, and we have the Security Council that adopted a resolution that has the 20 points. Not that the 20 points are perfect, they are far from perfect, but then now we have elements, withdrawal schedule in relation to steps and so on, and we have to have monitors that are impartial. If we don't have monitors that are impartial, then we will fall into another conflict and the situation will get much worse. So it is up to the United States as the one that presented the initiative of the 20 points plan. And we have to see what the rest of the world would do, because the rest of the world has an obligation through the Security Council, because the Security Council resolution has been passed. So it will not be easy, because for the most part, anything that deals with this situation, Israel makes it 100 times more challenging and more difficult and more complicated. But the hope is, as a result of what we have seen around the world from public opinion regarding what the atrocities that took place in Gaza, that this would result in some pressure over governments in different places around the world to ensure that Israel abides by its commitments and abides by the Security Council resolution.
Ambassador Hisham Youssef, thank you so much for these insights and for joining us here from Cairo tonight. And tonight's discussions reveal a world where power is increasingly personalized, institutions are strained, and diplomacy hinges on clarity or chaos. And from Washington's improvised security apparatus to Cairo's steadfast defense of Palestinian rights, the stakes could not be higher. And thank you for watching In Focus. Good night.